2022 was a pretty good year for quality video games. Obviously, you have Elden Ring, which won numerous accolades from many different outlets, but aside from that, there were other fantastic releases too. My personal favourite of the bunch is Xenoblade Chronicles 3, but I'm sure you'll find a lot of people out there who will champion a game like God of War Ragnarok, or people are able to look past the glitches and graphical issues and call the new Pokemon games their favourites. Or, if they can't, they might highlight the other well-received and acclaimed Pokemon game that came out last year. On the indie side, you have a lot of great contenders too. Many people loved Stray's Be a Cat type gameplay, and Vampire Survivors blew up and blazed a path for an entire new genre. Here's a good example of where the bar was set for games in 2022. A really solid Kirby title was released early in the year, and yet when year end came calling, I saw very few people drawing attention to it in their retrospectives. Part of that was probably down to it coming out so near to Elden Ring, which has sort of emerged as the canonical best game of 2022, but another part of it is just a signifier of how high the watermark for games was in the past year. Elden Ring emerges as a clear highlight from the general consensus, the GOTY of gaming's collective unconscious. But as I said earlier, I preferred Xenoblade Chronicles 3 to Elden Ring last year, so Xenoblade 3 must be my pick for Game of the Year, right? Well, it's a little more complicated than that. One obvious drawback of the idea of a Game of the Year is that it's a title that's impossible to objectively decide upon, because it's a completely subjective decision. Organisations like the Game Awards try to work around the decision by democratising that subjectivity, or at the very least adding some amount of polling and voting to the subjectivity. But still, even if every person on Earth was given an equal vote to decide on their Game of the Year, the game that got the highest score wouldn't be the objective Game of the Year, because at the end of the day, video games are an art form and like all art are subjective. Even if every other person on Earth loves Elden Ring, if you have a personal hatred for being described as foul, foolish or maidenless, you're probably not going to call it your favourite game of 2022. So, the inherent subjectivity of the idea of a Game of the Year is one reason I'm in no rush to declare that XBC3 is GOTY. However, there's another reason, and to illustrate it, I'll go back to my idea of having every single living human being vote for their favourite Game of the Year. While logistically this plan is waterproof and something I'm shocked the Game Awards haven't implemented yet, there is one big problem with it. Using this sample of 8 billion people, you're probably going to be polling a lot of people who aren't actually in a position to even cast an informed vote. Most of these people may not have played any video game at all from 2022. Millions of them are probably babies whose parents aren't even good enough guardians to have taught them what a game is yet. But if we really think about it, how informed can anyone be in this decision? I played a fair amount of games that came out last year, but nowhere close to all of them. If we say that I played 25 games last year that released in that year, and that number is probably on the generous side, that puts me as having played nowhere near enough games from 2022 to even subjectively declare which one is the best. Would you believe there were 7,123 games released in 2022? If you would, you're an idiot. That's only the number of games that were released on Steam within the first 8 months of the year. So even if I throw concerns about subjectivity to the wind and shout from the rooftops that Xenoblade Chronicles 3 is the Game of the Year 2022, I could still, subjectively, be wrong. 5 years from now, I could be playing a game like, Love Hentai and Puzzles, Dungeon Boobs, and I could have my own little Anton Ego from Ratatouille moment where I realise that, of all the games from 2022, this is the one made to fill the gap in my soul. It could happen. I like puzzle games and dungeons. Are you familiar with the expression to know one's onions? It originates from a man known as Charles Talbot Onions, an English grammarian and lexicographer who worked as an editor for the Oxford English Dictionary for much of the 20th century. In 1966, a year after C.T. Onion's death, the Oxford Dictionary of English Etymology was published, a book which collected the etymologies for many words in the English language, which Onions had spent the last 20 years of his life working on. With such a tome attributed to an editor like Onions, to know one's onions soon became a phrase meaning to have a great amount of knowledge or expertise over a specific subject, such as, in this case, English etymology. If one truly understands the breadth and depth of a category, if they can tell you, for example, about the allium family of plants, from chives to shallots, it can be said that they know their onions. All in reference to one man with a funny name from the previous century. Of course, if anyone in the audience knows their onions, they'll know that much of what I just said is completely wrong. While C.T. Onions did exist, and the expression to know your onions does mean what I've outlined it to mean previously, Any links between those two facts are completely circumstantial, given that the first recorded use of the phrase comes from the Oxford English Dictionary in 1902. That was more than 20 years before Onions edited the same publication's Dictionary of English Etymology, and 4 years before Onions was even in a position to prepare portions of the General English Dictionary. The incorrect etymology of the phrase can, I think, be traced back to an episode of the BBC Radio 4 programme You and Yours, but unfortunately, I'm not acquainted enough with my scallions to give a definitive answer. Equally indefinite in my research was an answer to the actual origin of the phrase, although it seems to have been selected from a whole crop of similar phrases which have been recorded in use throughout history. The expression is important because to truly give an answer as to which game is the game of the year for any given year, one must know their onions. And it turns out, in video games, there are a lot of onions to meet. More onions than you could ever really have time to meet, even. If I were to try and play enough of every game released in 2022 that I could give my subjective opinion on which, out of all of them, was the best of the year, it would probably take a lifetime. And at the end of that lifetime, all I would have for it would be just that, a subjective opinion, not an objective answer. This got me thinking two things. Number one, are there any years where few enough games were released that someone feasibly could play every game from that year in a reasonable time frame, thus allowing them to subjectively decide their game of the year from that crop? And further, the second thing, number two, are there any years where only one game was released, such that someone could play that game and experience what is, objectively, the game of that specific year? As soon as I thought that second thing, the first appealed to me less. What good was a well-researched subjective opinion when an unopinionated objective answer existed, after all? If you have an answer to that philosophical quandary, feel free to drop it in the comments below. With my task laid out before me, I set out to see if I could find my singular onion that I wanted to get to know. I really had to do a bit of a deep dive into the history of early video games, and it turns out that a dive like that is hard to do for a couple of reasons. The first is that, in general, most people, even those who are interested in video games as a hobby, know very little about the actual history of the medium. Take a look at this Tumblr post. Happy birthday video games, posted on the anniversary of the release of Pong. Now, sure, if you want to say that Pong is an important landmark in video game history, one of the first games to ever go mainstream and be commercially successful, I'll fully back up that claim. However, the idea that Pong was the first ever video game and that its release marks the birth of video games is laughable. As you'll see later in this video, there are multiple pieces of software released over a decade before Pong that can be argued to be the first ever video games, and to have their release date be the actual birthday of video games. However, despite the misinformation present in the post, it has over 1/3 notes at the time of writing. Now, sure, some of those notes are probably people correcting the inaccuracies, but the vast majority are people who see the information and just go along with it. Here's the other issue with the early history of video games though. Even amongst people who are familiar with the history of the medium, who can tell you that Pong isn't the first game, you're unlikely to find a consensus or a definitive answer on what that first game actually is. As I said earlier, there are many candidates released up to a decade before Pong that you can argue are actually the first video game. But that doesn't necessarily mean those arguments are very good or likely to convince a lot of people. Let's look at an example to show why the question of the first video game puts us in a sort of grey area. Birdie the Brain was a computer the size of a closet that you could play X's and O's against. It existed for 2 weeks at the 1950 Canadian exhibition and was disassembled once the exhibition ended. Depending on who you ask, some people might describe Birdie as the first ever video game, and if it was, it would certainly also be the first ever game of the year. Certainly, nothing else even arguably close to a video game was released publicly in that year. However, I'm not exactly convinced that Birdie the Brain is a video game. Firstly, the video aspect of a video game. Birdie lacks it. Birdie's X's and O's don't play out on a screen, but rather on a set of lights lit up by the computer to denote where an X or O has been placed. It's more of a gadget, device, or machine than an actual video game. Put it this way, I struggle to come up with a definition of a video game that includes something like Birdie the Brain, but disincludes something like a Bop It toy. When I express it that way, I think the notion of a definition for a video game starts to seem a bit nonsense, but like most definitions, it's a lot about feeling. Calling Bop It a video game feels wrong to me, and I expect it does to most other people as well. As Birdie the Brain is basically a huge, immobile, less complex Bop It, it feels wrong to call it a video game, either. A lot of the potential video games of the 1950s are in similar grey areas to Birdie the Brain. Take 1951's Nimrod, for example, which, like Birdie the Brain, was a specially designed computer for one purpose, to play the game of Nim. Like Bertie, Nimrod lacked a screen and used a light bulb to represent the objects that the player or the computer could remove on their turn. Also like Birdie, it fails to pass the BOPIT test. Also like Bertie, it has a name that lets you know something about the intelligence level of the computer, which doesn't actually mean anything, but I think it's interesting. If we jump ahead a few years, towards the end of the 1950s, we start encountering candidates for the first video game that finally pass the BOPIT test, as they start to use videos displayed on a screen, thus moving them a tick closer to video game and a tick further away from gadget or device. In 1958, Tennis for Two was first released to the public at the Brookhaven National Laboratory's annual public exhibition. The game plays on an oscilloscope screen and simulates a game of tennis for two players. Obviously, Tennis for Two passes the video portion of the video game definition, but it also, in my opinion, passes the game part of the definition more than many of its predecessors did as well. Think of it this way, Birdie the Brain and Nimrod aren't new games, and they aren't even really adaptations. They just take two classic games, X's and O's and Nim, and let you play them against an AI partner. Obviously, for the 1950s, that's nothing to scoff at, but no new rules were invented, and no changes to the previous rules had to be made. Tennis for Two is different. In 1958, you couldn't just perfectly copy the game of tennis and put it on a computer. William Higginbotham and Robert Dvorak, the two men who built and designed Tennis for Two, had to perform actual adaptational work to get something that resembled tennis running on a 1950s computer. Tennis for Two, of course, is inspired by tennis, but it used that inspiration to produce something the world had never seen before. So, this all seems pretty convincing. Tennis for Two reaches both the video and game definitions that many previous candidates have failed to clear. And yet, there are still a few minor details that hold me back from calling it the first proper video game. First is that while Tennis for Two does clear the BOPIT test, it doesn't exactly pass the test with flying colours. It's still not really a piece of software. Tennis for Two was only ever played on a purpose-built computer in the Brookhaven National Laboratory's public exhibition days in 1958 and 1959. You couldn't ever take Tennis for Two home to play for yourself, and even if you had access to a computer in the 1950s, you wouldn't have been able to play Tennis for Two. It only ever ran on the one specific machine it was built for. Because of that, it can be hard to delineate where Tennis for Two the game starts, and where Tennis for Two, the hardware that existed just to run the game Tennis for Two, stops. The other issue is that Tennis for Two is sort of lost media. As mentioned, it only existed as a computer built to be displayed at a public exhibition. It was shown for a couple of days in 1958, was shown again at the same exhibition in 1959 with some adjustments made to the physics engine to add a few extra game modes, and then, after that, like Birdie the Brain before it, the Tennis for Two computer was disassembled. Of course, the game isn't functionally lost. For example, I can hop on the Google Play Store right now and download a game which is purporting itself to be Tennis for Two, and has the same sort of oscilloscope graphics and looks similar to footage of the original machine in use. But that isn't really Tennis for Two, or even an emulation of Tennis for Two, it's a recreation. Tennis for Two isn't something that can be emulated, because it's not really a piece of software, it was custom built hardware. The title of this video is I played the first game of the year, and I can see some people being convinced that that isn't true because, spoilers, I didn't play Tennis for Two to make this video. Because no one can anymore, and no one has been able to since they took it apart almost 40 years before I was even born. While Tennis for Two is definitely more of a video game than predecessors like Birdie the Brain or Nimrod, I'm still not sure that it feels 100% to me to say that it's definitely a video game. However, we're close. 3 years after Tennis for Two was disassembled forever. If we look up to the stars, we might just see what I consider to be the first ever undisputable video game. In the autumn of 1961, a new computer, the PDP-1, was installed at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. The PDP-1 was known as a mini-computer due to its relative compactness and ease of use. At the time, many computers could only be run with a designated and trained operator around to assist in its operation, and even the simpler machines required a degree of knowledge and patience just to get turned on. The PDP-1 was a lot simpler than any of that, having an on-off switch that could be used to easily change the device's power state at any time. The accessibility of the PDP-1 made programming a lot easier. Whereas before, a programmer could design their code, then have to wait to see it actually running on a computer, probably with the help of an operator, the pick-up and play nature of the PDP-1 meant that sitting down and messing around with a bit of code was far easier than ever before. The arrival of the PDP-1 at MIT had been greatly anticipated by three fellows of the institute: J. Martin Graetz, Stephen Slug Russell, and Wayne Wittinen. The three had spent the time leading up to the installation of the machine imagining what could be done with it, and the prophesized CRT screen that was to be installed alongside it. Inspired by their love of space opera serial fiction and the Toho Company's kaiju films, the three designed a demonstration of the power of the PDP-1 with three core tenets in mind. Number 1. The capabilities of the computer should be shown off as best as possible, by taxing the computer as much as possible. Number 2. It should be interesting and look different every time it's run. Number 3. The demonstration should involve the viewer in some way. It should be a game. Wanting their game to feature action and require a certain level of skill, and knowing the visual limitations presented by the very early screen technology provided by the CRT scope, it was decided that the game would focus on two opposing spaceships doing battle in deep space. Once the PDP-1 and the CRT arrived at MIT, a team of programmers, called hackers at the time, got to work. The game was developed alongside other pieces of software that were being ported, adapted, or invented for the new computer. A lot of the initial work that went on while the game was being built was in putting everyday use programs onto the PDP-1. For example, a word processor, known as Expensive Typewriter. Expensive was a common prefix for many early PDP-1 programs, highlighting that even though the mini-computer had made computers and programming much more accessible, there was still a pretty high barrier for entry. PDP-1s were only really found in colleges and universities with large academic budgets. Adjusted for inflation, a PDP-1 would, at the time, run you for a price equivalent to over $1 million today. With development on the game properly beginning in late 1961, a playable version was complete by February of 1962, and Space War! Vital was first presented to the public 2 months later at the MIT Parents' Weekend at the end of April of 1962. By September of 1962, the final version of the game worked on by the original programming team, Space War 3.1, was finished. The game was a hit at MIT, and because, unlike earlier candidates for the first video game, Space War was a piece of software, not hardware, the code could be sent to other institutions with their own PDP-1 computers and played there. This code means that, unlike something like Tennis for Two, Space War can still be played today on PDP-1 emulators. If you're interested in trying Space War out for yourself, I'd recommend you check out the version available on the MassWork website. There's a link available in the description. The site hosts numerous versions of Space War from across its development history, and has more about the history of the game too, if that piques your interest. With all that being said, it's time to get into the nitty-gritty. What is it actually like to play Space War? In Space War, you take on the role of either the Needle or the Wedge, two starfighters named after their distinctive shapes, which are fated to battle around a black hole in deep space forever. The ships have 4 functions. They can turn, accelerate, fire a missile, or jump in hyperspace. Barring hyperspace, these functions are all fairly self-explanatory. Think of the hyperspace jump as an emergency last-minute evasive maneuver. When activated, your ship disappears for a few seconds before reappearing at a random location on the screen. The black hole in the center of the screen is the last thing of note. It generates its own gravity, pulling both the Needle and the Wedge towards it. Depending on the version of Space War you're playing, contact with the black hole either results in instant death, or in your craft being teleported to the 4 corners of the screen, which, due to the wraparound nature of the scope's presentation, are all the same single point. That's it. Some of the mechanics are a bit more complex than an initial description might seem, like your missile and fuel reserves, which are both limited and can run out, or the hyperspace jump, which has a random chance to cause a self-destruct which becomes more likely the more you use it. But on the whole, the game is made up of a black hole and 4 simple commands which you can input for your ship to carry out. What's most remarkable about the game then, in spite of this seeming simplicity, is the at the time absurd complexity it has on offer. This complexity is in part created by the interplay of the different mechanics. For example, in earlier versions of Space War, there were concerns amongst the developers that the game relied too much on sheer reaction speed and motor skills. This was the inspiration for the addition of the black hole, which adds an extra layer of strategy. Players must now take into account the gravitational pull on their ship, and can attempt to use this force to their advantage, setting up stable orbits or slingshotting out of the path of incoming enemy missiles. In versions of the game where the black hole serves as a teleport rather than an instant death, it can even serve as a knockoff hyperspace jump, allowing the player to quickly move from one part of the screen to another. Ironically, the black hole doesn't exist in a vacuum. It was designed from the ground up to build a layer of strategy into the already existing mechanics. There's other mechanics too, that seem like they exist to add complexity and strategy. It's easy to imagine a version of Space War which lacks a limited fuel and missile supply, and how that version might turn every match into a game of charge the opponent and blast indiscriminately. With the restrictions as they are in the actual game though, players must be careful and thoughtful about how they use their resources. Running out of missiles puts you in an evasive mode where all you can do is hope to dodge however many attacks your opponent has left, and running out of fuel leaves you a sitting duck, relying on the pull of the black hole or a hyperspace jump to avoid attacks. Running out of both is effectively a death sentence if the opposing player was more conservative in their tactics. The hyperspace jump is such an elegant piece of game design. In early versions of Space War, to counteract concerns that the jump would make the game boring if spammed, it was limited to only 3 uses. Even in these versions, the jump is still a neat little mechanic. Getting a last minute jump before a missile hits you is always exciting, and the random location it spits you back out in can create some cool, advantageous moments.
Right behind you.
In later versions though, the jump is taken from good to great, as instead of 3 fixed uses it can be used up to 7 times. But, as said earlier, each use comes with a risk attached. Every subsequent time a player jumps, the chance of a self-destruction increases, until the 8th jump when death is guaranteed. While the chances are low, even your very first jump isn't always going to be completely safe. This seasoning of risk applied to an already well-cooked, tasty mechanic only makes it even more appetizing. The focus on increasing the complexity of a relatively simple set of base properties can be found all over the game. Missiles are a good example. They have only a limited range before they time out and explode. Obviously, this prevents the screen from becoming a mess of infinitely looping inaccurate missiles in late game scenarios, but it also means the game is constantly encouraging you to get up closer to your opponent. You can't just wait at range taking pot shots forever. The game's missiles also illustrate exactly how well the game sticks to one of its original design tenets, that the demonstration should push the PDP-1 to its limits. Missiles are unaffected by the gravity exerted by the black hole, and can pass through it freely without being destroyed or teleported. This is a pure memory limitation, as the PDP-1 has enough memory to model gravity on the needle and wedge, but not enough to model it for the 10 plus extra missiles that might exist at any time on screen. However, this limitation only provides an extra layer of complexity to the game, as missiles that have passed unaffected through the black hole may return right back to an unlucky sender who's entered orbit. Orbit is another very important mechanic. Players start well out of missile range from each other, but with the pull of the black hole dragging them in before they get a chance to engage the accelerator, and the amount of thrust needed to escape its gravity, that situation changes rapidly as both ships approach the centre of the screen. In games played by first timers, a mess of missiles around the middle of the scope, or mutually assured destruction as both players are teleported to the same spot by the black hole, are likely to be responsible for many initial deaths. However, as players get more familiar, you can see them in real time learn first the perfect angle and acceleration needed to generate sufficient velocity to escape the black hole's pull, then, later, how to angle themselves even more precisely to enter an orbit around the middle of the screen and establish map dominance. Even those steps have an extra bit of learning that can be built on top of them. How to pull off these maneuvers while also accurately firing missiles at the enemy ship, a moving target who is probably also trying to do weird things with the black hole's gravity. In the MIT Computer Lab, in Space War's early days, a popular opening move emerged called the CBS opening, where both players moved towards the black hole and attempted to enter a perfectly circular orbit. Playing the game myself with friends for this video, I saw similar openings emerge unprompted. Openings like this, which require quite precise movement around the screen and specific angling of your ship, are only possible thanks to the game's graphics, particularly the background star field. These stars were added by the hackers during development to help players more accurately position themselves, rather than just having the whole game take place in a dark void. Originally, the star pattern was just randomly generated, but that changed when the developers co-opted a newly developed piece of software for the PDP-1 called Expensive Planetarium, which was partially created for use in Space War. Expensive Planetarium, as a standalone app and as a feature of Space War, models much of the night sky, including many familiar constellations. As the game is played, the displayed section of the night sky slowly moves, and certain stars are even coded to flash more frequently than others, allowing them to emulate the real-life brightness differences of these celestial bodies. It's this attention to detail, this willingness to develop from a blank void to a randomly generated starfield to a recreation of the real night sky, that can be found all over Space War, in the way it takes what are the relatively simple game mechanics and design ideas available in 1962, and builds on them to make something that adds up to be more than the sum of its parts. This trait may not be the only reason for the relative complexity of Spacewar. Its multiplayer-only nature also allows for more multifaceted gameplay expressions, as another human player will usually create more complex scenarios to respond to than a CPU opponent, especially if said opponent is relying on the level of AI technology available in the early 1960s. It's something seen a lot in early video games, this imposition of multiplayer to add an extra layer of complexity that a computer opponent can't. Take a look at Tennis for Two, or even Pong, which also rely on the same thing. But also take a look at Tennis for Two and Pong, two games which, even accounting for the depth added by their multiplayer nature, are nowhere near as deep in potential complexity as Spacewar. To try and put a bottom line on things, did you ever have a class in school in the computer lab, and instead of doing the work you were meant to be doing, you and your friends would just go to pirate music websites and play flash games? I'm not saying that if you and your friends discovered Spacewar then, you would all consider it to be the best game ever made. Maybe you wouldn't even think of it as the best flash game ever made. It would, however, I think be something that you would keep coming back to on those days in the computer lab, and you'd play it over and over again while listening to a remix of Shake That by Eminem one of your classmates had found on 8 tracks that, little did you know, you'd never be able to find again once you got home that evening. All that from a game made and released 33 years before Flash Player was available to the public. To put an even simpler bottom line on things, one that requires you to have attended secondary school at a less specific point in time than I did, a couple of days ago, I went to a bowling alley with one of the friends who I played Spacewar with to collect footage for this video, and we played a couple of games of bowling. Spacewar is better than bowling. For all that I've harped on the core simplicity of Spacewar, and particularly of its basic controls, that certainly wasn't true in 1962. Spacewar was, at the time, one of the first developments in a new frontier. The game had to be played using the switches and knobs built into the PDP-1, as game controllers didn't exist yet. How could they? Controllers had to be crafted by hand by the Spacewar hackers, and these early controllers were mostly made up out of model railway parts, as many of the developers were also part of the Tech Model Railway Club at MIT. So, the original team behind Spacewar had not only made one of the best candidates for first ever video game, they'd also developed video game controllers to go along with it. But, as I said, by September of '62, the final version of the game that team had worked on was already out, and most of the hackers had moved out of MIT and onto other institutions. While many of the team continued to work in engineering and computer science related fields, none of them, as far as I can tell from my research, ever worked prominently on another game. All surviving members who contributed to Spacewar in those initial months did, in 2018, receive from the Smithsonian and the Academy of Interactive Arts and Sciences an award to commemorate their contribution to gaming as a medium. It's nice that they got some level of recognition like this eventually, due to the open source nature of Spacewar's release, encouraged by the hacker ethic of the 60s computer programming scene. It's unlikely any of the team behind the game ever made any money for the hours they poured into their passion project, at least initially. Still, while the hacker team behind Spacewar may not have spent the rest of their lives in the game design scene, Spacewar itself certainly did. As the game spread from institute to institute, university to university, it was edited and iterated upon, each college you winded up at having their own version of Spacewar with their own unique house rules. There's a quote from award-winning computer scientist Alan Kay, who in 1972, 10 years after Spacewar originally came out, describes it as a game which blossoms spontaneously whenever there is a graphics display connected to a computer. This ubiquity is reflected in Spacewar's place in video game history too. Also in 1972, the first ever video game tournament, the first ever esports event, the first ever Intergalactic Spacewar Olympics was held in Stanford. Interestingly, this tournament was played on a version of the game which had hyperspace jumps turned off, showing that, literally from their inception, proto-pro gamers have been sweaty tryhards who couldn't recognize elegant game design if it was orbiting a black hole shooting missiles in their face. So, that's Spacewar. The question remains, were any other video games released in that year that would subjectify the whole thing up? Or can Spacewar be declared the definitive, objective game of the year for 1962? Well, there are other contenders. There's a Polish game called Marienbad, for example, which is another adaptation of the game of Nim, based on an appearance the game made in the film Last Year at Marienbad. However, Marienbad isn't an original game, like Spacewar. It's not even the first adaptation of Nim into a semi-video game format. Put it this way, I like Tetris a lot. That doesn't mean I'm going to say it's a contender for best game of 2006 just because that's when iPod Tetris came out. Marienbad has another thing holding it back too. It's lost media. It was never distributed as widely as Space War, and only ever programmed onto 2 computers at locations its programmer, Witold Podgorski, worked at. The computer it was made to run on, the Odra 1003, has only one surviving working unit still in existence, and the code to create Marienbad is lost forever. The lost nature of Marienbad is something interesting to bring up because it might not be the only lost game from 1962 or earlier out there. Many games at the time only existed on one computer and were never spread from them. There might be other games out there developed by a handful of early 60s computer nerds that never saw the light of day, and now they don't even exist in the form of Marienbad, as a Wikipedia article reporting on a lost game. For the premise of this video to continue though, we'll ignore that possibility. I think I'm fairly happy at this point to say that Space War is the one original video game released in 1962, and I'm also happy to say that, based on my own prognostications, there are no games released before Space War that come as close to being a video game as it does. Now, knowing my onions, I can declare Space War to not only be the objective definitive Game of the Year 1962, but also the objective definitive first Game of the Year of all time. None of that really matters though. This video isn't really about trying to find out what the first Game of the Year is. I just want to highlight a cool bit of history and encourage people to look into some of that history for themselves. Do you think my argument for Space War being the first ever video game is shaky? Do you think Marienbad is definitely its own game and needs to be considered in any ranking of 1962's best? Great, because if you think those things, it means you think something else too. That Pong isn't the first video game ever made, and the birthday of video games. Plus, I mean, obviously Space War isn't the Game of the Year of 1962. That honor goes to Super Mario Bros. 2, baby! Game of the Year every year! Super Mario Bros. 2, baby! Super Mario Bros. 2. Super Mario Bros. 10.
Super Mario Brothers 2. It's
Super Mario Bros. 2! Oops, it's actually Super Mario Bros.
It was all a dream.